right, and we are live on Facebook now. Thank you everybody for joining us for our 14th anti-hate session, our anti-hate community conversations. Before we get started on today's session, I want to do a brief land acknowledgement. The work of the Council of Agencies Serving South Asians takes place on traditional Indigenous territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the allied nations to peaceably share and care for their resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by the Upper Canada Treaties. Today, Takaranto, the traditional Mohawk name of this area called Toronto, meaning a gathering place, and its surrounding areas are still home to Indigenous people, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to meet, work, and play on this territory as settlers. So today's conversation, we are going to focus a little bit on anti-homophobia. And as we are focusing on anti-homophobia, we also want to acknowledge that the recognition of two-spirit identity is crucial to reconciliation conversations. And in doing so, we extend solidarity to Indigenous LGBTQ and two-spirit communities in calling for the filling of the glaring gaps in supports and services for these communities, without which they really are put in risk of harm. So as I mentioned, today's focus is on talking about anti-homophobia. We will discuss issues of discrimination, racism, and hate that the LGBTQ community and two-spirit communities face, particularly the challenges that they're facing by people that are racialized, and also how we can play a part as community agencies or the community at large in working together to eliminate those barriers and challenges. And we have two great panelists here today with us. We have Praney, Anand, and Yosh Perera. And a quick bio of our guests before I engage them in the conversation. Praney Anand has over 10 years of experience in sexual health education, counseling, and research. Most recently, he has worked as research coordinator at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto for a number of behavioral research science projects examining intersectional aspects of health within gender and sexual minority communities. He has previously worked at the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention as the Men's Education and Support Coordinator before he became the interim executive director. In a short period of time in Toronto, Praney has established strong ties with organizations working in sexual health and community services, particularly those in the field of HIV/AIDS. So again, this is not Praney's full bio, but we will be posting full bios of both of our speakers after the session in the comments section. Yosh Perera identifies as a queer South Asian settler on this land and is a healthcare disruptor at heart, equipped with formal education in public health and clinical medicine. He currently works towards a master's in health design with OCAD University. He has navigated a variety of experiences supporting health communications, primary healthcare delivery, and community health promotion programs. His experiences are shaped by the importance of centering community voices and working with communities to support health equity gains. So if you're tuning in for the first time, again, this series is part of CASA's ongoing anti-hate work that we do in collaboration with the Anti-Hate Community Leaders Group. And these sessions take place every other Tuesdays, so it's not every week now, at 4 p.m. And you can view it live on Facebook, or you can view it on CASA's YouTube channel after the session. So we'll begin, and I know we don't have a lot of time for this, so I'd like to get right into it. So this question is for both of you, and maybe you can take turns answering it. What are some of the major issues currently faced by members of the LGBTQ 2S+ communities as a result of homophobia? In answering that, can you also give us some examples of how homophobia actually plays out in the communities that you serve? I don't want to take for granted that people understand what homophobia is, so perhaps you can bring in some of those examples. Praney, do you want to go first?
Sure, and thank you for the extra probe there, because I was thinking, I think just to even understand the issues faced by our communities as a result of homophobia, we also need to examine what homophobia exactly is and what causes this sort of fear of the unknown. It's like, who are these people? Why do they have different sexualities and what's wrong with them. So all those are questions that I think stem from this fear of the unknown, lack of information, misinformation about not just same-sex sexuality but diversity in sexuality. So, or even speaking of sexuality as a whole, I think we're just programmed to believe that sexuality is this one sort of linear progression of life stages, and it's very heteronormative. We look back to our books or to stories that we hear from family members growing up, people we see around us, we see this one sort of set pattern of things. So I think anything that falls outside those lines causes anxiety in people, and just this fear of unknown and not really understanding a person for who they are, but through our pre-programmed lens is what may be one of those few factors or some of those factors that cause homophobia. To your first question, I'd say, I think, and I was thinking of very practical things. I'm thinking of, what do people end up doing as a result of experiencing homophobia? They either hide themselves, they either move to different countries, they make poor healthcare decisions, poor sexual health decisions. So when we're working with communities, we're thinking of people who have absolutely no idea how to have conversations with their families or friends. And they're constantly in hiding, just hiding this one beautiful, wonderful part of their life, just thinking that they can never be their authentic selves in front of others. And how that perhaps impacts their emotional well-being, their mental well-being, and in some cases, their physical well-being as well. And by working with racialized communities, we understand that a lot of people actually move to countries like Canada because they want to live a safer life in a country that doesn't stigmatize or criminalize any form of sexuality that's not, quote unquote, the norm. And we see a lot of people moving to, for example, Canada, Toronto, and sometimes with not enough adequate resources to actually live a thriving life here. So those are the issues that I'm thinking of. I'm also thinking of poor sexual health decisions, just because now that some people are here in Toronto, for example, a big city, you're out and about, you're thinking, oh, this is what I always wanted. But then you're faced with challenges such as racism and not feeling like you actually belong here. And you get an opportunity to be intimate with somebody, and you sort of sometimes forego any sexual health precautions or considerations that you would have ideally made, just because now you're in a space where you're finally sort of getting what you needed. But also you've been experiencing a lot of rejection from the mainstream society because of your color or your accent or the way you speak or the way you dress, which may not be, quote unquote, part of the usual society. So you're kind of not, you don't end up belonging to either your home culture or your new culture sometimes.
Thanks a lot for that, Praney. And I really liked how you brought in the social determinants of health approach to that, and also systemic issues and racism and how that impacts personal decisions people make. Yosh, do you want to jump in?
Absolutely. And thanks for the introduction as well, Samia. And I'm connecting to you all from Peel region, which is the territories of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I think it's a very powerful question that you're asking. What are some of the major issues currently faced by members of the 2L LGBTQ+ community, specifically around as a result of homophobia? And to kind of piggyback on Praney's response as well, I think, we live in a system and we are products of a system, right? So we're kind of taught to look at the world a very specific way. We're taught to treat each other a very specific way based on how we've experienced the rest of the world. So there's this ongoing narrative that we all live the same lives. So as a direct result, when we come across someone who lives a completely different life, right? We are fearful of how that's gonna affect our normal well-being, right? And what is normal, right? normal is just a setting on a dishwasher. That's something one of my friends says. What is normalcy at the end of the day? So for me, when I think of homophobia, it's really that context that, like, you know, you're fearful of something that you do not understand, or you're taking, or not taking the time to understand. I think when I think of concrete examples of homophobia and what this looks like, I think of, you know, not being able to tell your close friends, folks in your social network, who you're attracted to, who you choose to love, with the fear of some kind of negative impact, right? Fear of not being able to have a conversation with your parents about what you want for the rest of your life because you're afraid that you're going to get kicked out of the home. I think those are often, you know, the fears that we have growing up. And for me, I can come from my own perspective. You know, it's often some of these conversations take place in large family gatherings, right? And it perpetuates a sense of fear. And often because of that fear, we're taught to kind of hide ourselves and be who we are. So I think, you know, I recently heard a CBC podcast recently about intergenerational families, you know, living together and how that might be contributing to COVID numbers, right? I think, you know, that's also something to think about, in the sense that, you know, racialized families in particular, you know, our sense of community, our sense of a social unit, our sense of a family is very different, right? And I don't think that should be perceived as a risk to any kind of infectious disease. But what ultimately ends up happening is the concept of who we are, whether we're gay, bisexual, lesbian, trans, the concept of who we are in relation to that social unit or family becomes very different, right? And it becomes something that we have to constantly navigate and define. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I'm just trying to reflect on the number of things that are kind of like contributing right now to what we think and how we look at homophobia.
That was a really, really well put answer, Yosh. And like with that answer, I'm like really deeply understanding where your head is at and what you're thinking, and some of the challenges and the conflicts within your own kind of decision making within your own family spaces. So definitely, and I know that we can't kind of dig deeper into all of those concepts individually, but definitely it gives us an opportunity to think about them. My next question is, in terms of being a racialized person and being a member of the LGBTQ2S+ community, are there additional barriers that you face as a result of your intersectional identities? And that question comes from a place, like I've done conversations like for example, people doing the environmental justice movement and being racialized in that movement, there's barriers for them too, right? So, so what do you think about this particular question? Yosh, do you want to go first in this one?
Sure, for sure. You know, I think when you ask about, you know, what additional barriers do racialized folks come across, you know, I think about syndemics theory. Syndemics theory is pretty much, you know, talking about the fact that there are co-occurring epidemics at a given time, right? So even now, when you think about COVID, and then you also think about, you know, the historic impact of HIV/AIDS on racialized communities as well as queer and trans communities. And then on top of that, you add racism, not race, but racism, right? It has a cumulative effect, and it's gonna impact folks in very different ways. I cannot imagine what the impact is like for a member of the African Caribbean Black community, but I can definitely stand in solidarity without no question of what that impact might look like. I need to, as another fellow racialized member of the community and as an ally, I need to stand in solidarity with that. So I hope that kind of answers your question. When I think about the specific example you talked around climate justice, I think a little bit from the perspective of settlement and how the migration of racialized communities to Canada as a settler colonial state, when you think about in that context, we're often brought into this country as immigrants with a specific amount of knowledge and expertise in a specific field. So even whether it's climate justice or whether it is any kind of employment sector, when a racialized body is trying to navigate that space, it comes with a lot more barriers, whether it means that we have to show our worth 2 to 3, 4 more times of a caliber than our non-racialized counterparts. And that's just in my opinion. But I'm glad I'm seeing a few head nods.
Praney, do you want to add and agree with Yosh?
No, that's absolutely true, Yosh. And it may not be each and every person's story, but it's definitely something that as a group we all face and see and are impacted by. So every racialized person may not have the same sort of journey. And there is a lot of uniqueness and nuances to that. But as a community, yes, we're all facing those additional barriers just because we are part of the non-normative community, so to speak. In relation to the questions, I mean, I was thinking similar to Yoshi, I was thinking of minority stress, right? So the theory of minority stress says that if you have a minority identity of being racialized, and then and there are stressors that come with that. On top of that, if you're racialized, there's minority stress. If you're part of the queer community, then there's additional stress. If you also happen to be somebody living with a disability, then there's additional stress. So all of that cumulatively becomes a person's life experience. And the more identities we keep adding to ourselves, so I identify as an immigrant, a brown person, gay person, and so these are the minority stresses that I'm living with. Other people may have more intersecting identities. And so it's hard to unlayer and say, oh, well, if you were not gay, your life would be easy. No, but it's an intersection of all your identities that make up your life. So it's not easy. Intersections are not overlapping in that sense. So it's hard to tease out where one part of your identity begins and the other, where they kind of intersect and collide and become your whole individuality, right? So that's the beauty of intersectionality. So when there are spaces, there are gay spaces, there are queer spaces where racialized people may not feel at home, but then there might be racialized spaces where queer people may not feel at home. And how do you sort of tease that? And where do you find your home? How do you make that home for yourself? And how do you feel, where do you feel comfort as a person living with your experiences? Sort of my thoughts about that. And the other thing that came to mind immediately when I heard your question was, when racialized people from the queer community end up seeking, let's say, mental health, who are the service providers? Do they actually get what intersectionality means? Do they actually understand the impact of a racialized queer person living as an immigrant, living as a second generation person in Canada? And are you really able to understand that minority stress that the person is going through? And are you able to really do justice being their service provider? Yes, and perhaps no.
That's a really great point. So as we're talking about service providers, let's go talk a little bit about institutions and what can institutions do. So I have here schools or employers, but you can talk about other institutions if you want. So how can institutions such as schools and workplaces be more inclusive to members of the LGBTQ2S+ communities and in becoming more cognizant of the challenges that they're facing and in trying to address those challenges? Praney?
I can think of an example that I heard a few years ago, and I thought that was beautiful. A friend's kid went to the school where, in primary school, I think, or kindergarten, they're supposed to bring photographs of their families, and pin them on a board. And you could bring in any photograph that made sense for you. So the project was, you can bring pictures of who you consider your family, and bring it to school, we'll display it, and then talk about how different families can look like. So I think that was a very powerful tool in the sense of making young people from a very early age look at all the different variations in families: single parents, queer parents, non-parents, living with grandparents, living with 5 different kinds of generations or uncles and aunties and all of that, right? So I think that's a beautiful exercise that comes to mind. I think something like that, that really normalizes the diversity of experiences that we all live with from a very early age is essential when it comes to schools. I think workplaces obviously will have to play catch up a little bit because we're all adults by the time we're working. And this reminds me of an example from back in India, that despite not having a lot of equal rights as a partner to or same-sex partners, there are organizations that have themselves started internal programs to recognize your partner and whoever that partner is. So just moving away from this traditional sense of, oh, you can only ask for benefits for your spouse. Now conversations are moving from there to, will include your partner, whoever that partner is. And I think, and that's the step that some organizations are taking, for example, back in India. And I think, so the important thing to highlight is the initiative. You don't wait for things like law and policies to change, but what's in your hand is your own company policy. You don't have to wait till gay marriage is legalized to offer equal rights to all your employees. You can create a cultural shift within from ground up. You don't really have to wait for someone to tell you that these are the HR policies, this is what Ontario labor law says. No, I think we all have the ability to be human and understand that we need to make people feel included and not sidelined.
It's a really good point. Thank you, Praney. Yosh, do you have anything to add?
I think Praney kind of really summed that up really well. The one thing I would say is, just ask your community, whatever that community looks like, ask that community before you do anything, because you don't want to be performative either, right? You don't want to just take what works for one community and try to work it into your community. And what I mean by community is your community in an organization or an institution, right? Just ask folks for their input before you do anything. That would be the major piece that I would try to add on to. Because often, we have a very siloed way of looking at things, and what we see might appear like a very homogeneous group of folks, but we're full of certain quirks and certain ways in which we navigate the world, and certain ways in which we wish to be identified that you might not know if you don't ask, right? So it's important that asking piece is, that humility piece, I would say, is very important.
Great, thank you for that add-on, Yosh. So the next question is, just in terms of, I know you spoke a little bit, Yosh, about allyship. So in terms of allyship within our own community, so I'll be a little bit specific in this one, in the South Asian community. So we know there's a lot of issues internally in the community that we have to work on. So what can people do, just like the general public in the South Asian community, organizations that serve South Asians, or leaders within the South Asian community? So these three groups, what role do they have in trying to be effective allies to the LGBTQ2+ communities? Yosh, do you want to take that one on first? Or do you want to think about it?
No, I'll try and sum it up real quick. I think when I think of communities, the one thing I would ask communities to do, or if you're just a single person listening to this video today, just take a step back and think about what do you know about queer and trans communities, or LGBTQ+ communities, or 2S LGBTQ+ communities, whatever language you use. What do you know of us? And is that based off of fact, or is that based off of, and if it is based off of fact, what fact? Is it the brother you know, the cousin you know, the friend you know? And is it a truth that applies to all of us? And is there an opportunity for you to start a dialogue with with other people to get, not necessarily to understand us, because how can you understand any human being? Can someone else fully understand another human being, right? So maybe to get a better way of navigating systems and supporting us. For organizations and institutions, I would say it is your responsibility to create a platform or an opportunity for this dialogue that I just mentioned to take place. And I think if you just assume that there is no place for that dialogue, then you haven't done the work to establish the importance of having that dialogue with the rest of your community, right? Yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Thank you. Praney?
I'm going to share a bit of a personal story here. So when I came out to my sister, and it happened in many different parts, right? We all come out. We don't just come out once. We come out every day in a sense. When I came out to my sister, she actually just told me that, she read something or heard something when I was a teenager. And so she kind of heard the news indirectly, let's say 5 years before I actually came out to her. And she said, I didn't want to ask you about it because it was your story to share and not for me to ask you about it. However, what I did was I made sure that I understood what it means to be a sister to a gay brother. So she did her research in those years to understand, or at least try to understand, what it means to have a queer person in your life. And I think she did a fabulous job, but I think it's the sentiment that counts. You don't let, there are conversations where it's like, well, people want to be an ally, but they end up almost pounding the person, be like, tell me everything about your life. And no, we're not agents of change every single day, and especially when we're not working. And we are queer people sometimes working in queer spaces. And this is something we probably do every day, but then this is not the entirety of our life. And our job is not to educate every single person. We can let you know about our lives, about my day. I can let you know how I'm feeling right now. And we can help you sort of navigate some of those difficult questions to our best capability, but then don't only rely on this one person as a resource to tell you everything about being queer or being racialized or anything. I think what Yosh said about taking a step back is also something I believe in. I think if you want to be an ally, learn to be in this room, be in the same space without taking up a lot of space. How do you stand with somebody without overshadowing their presence in their sort of space? And we see this all the time in Pride, right? So be there if you're a straight person, a non-queer person supporting Pride and joining your queer friends at Pride. Don't be the loudest voice in the room. Smile with them, support them, ask them what's needed, but don't try to be this cool person who's showed up, right? Like, it's not about you. So I think when we learn to take a step back and say, okay, I need to really understand what my role is as a non-queer person, as a non-racialized person, to be an effective ally, that's when you can probably start thinking about specific steps that you can take to support your friends. And not everyone needs the same kind of allyship. So I think it's also important to understand you're not two different queer people would not have the same response to what it means to be an ally. So really have to, it's a complicated question. I think it's a complex thing to understand. But just to kind of wrap that up, I think understanding your own social location is very important, and understanding your own privilege is very important before you can do any of that. I think getting a sense of where you stand is the first step for you to think of, oh, how do I take a step back and let there be space for other things to grow?
Thank you so much. And that the response to the allyship, I think, resonates with allyship to various different causes. And we've heard that throughout this series where to be an ally, it's not about you. I think that's a very important statement that you made, Praney. So unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. Are any closing thoughts before we say goodbye?
I just have one closing thought. I think, thank you so much to CASA. As an agent of Moyo Health and Community Services, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about homophobia in this context. And I think more than homophobia, we need to try to create even more spaces to talk about transphobia and the visibility of trans bodies in our work, and also our commitment to their health as well. Thanks again.
Thank you, Yosh. Praney?
That's an excellent point, Yosh. I think we forget that we're not a homogenous community. I think there is diversity of experiences within the queer community and within racialized queer communities. And we must talk about them as well, and not just do lip service, but actually engage with those issues and make sure that voices are heard and action is implemented. I don't know if that's correct usage of the words, but we must implement those actions and not just be passive agents of change, but be active agents of change. And I think we all also need to recognize our location as South Asians working in a non-South Asian sort of country, right? And we have the ability to create something. And how do we optimally do that without leaving behind our fellow people?
Really great points, and I taking that well noted point, and I think especially for the South Asian communities, the discrimination and hate and harassment of the trans community extends many years, and so definitely point noted, and we will hopefully address that in the near future in these series. Thank you so much once again, Praney and Yosh, for joining us today. Thanks to all our viewers as well. And we will be back in 2 weeks. So that's Tuesday, October 6th at 4 p.m. And we will continue to explore issues of hate and how to address them. Thank you.
Thank you.